Right, the first thing we're going to do is take our first ring. We've got the ring mounting nut on this side of it here. Now it doesn't matter which direction these go, which side of the rifle the nut's on. I prefer to have the nut on the opposite side from the bolt handle. So if you're a right-handed shooter, you're going to have the nut on the left side of the rifle. If you've got a left-handed rifle, bolt being on the other side, then just simply switch it and put the nut on the other side. I like to start on the rearmost slot. It just seems to work for me. It's, you know, a place to start to get some better adjustment. Now we're just going to finger tighten these right now. When you do so, you see how there's a little bit of play forward and back on the ring. Almost all rings will have this little bit of play. Now because when you fire the rifle, the recoil forces want to push the rifle back. The scope wants to stay where it's at. So when the rifle slides back, the scope wants to slam forward against the rings, and then the rings against the mount. So when you're mounting these, you want to push the ring as far forward as you can against the Picatinny rail slots, and then tighten that down by hand. Now we're just snugging them down by hand right now until we get everything mocked up, and then we'll go back and we'll tighten it. Now for your second ring, it gets a little trickier. Depending on your scope, how much tube you have between the ocular housing and the turret housing, and between the objective bell and the turret housing. That's going to matter on where you put your rings. Now what we can do is just kind of sit it in the rear ring here, kind of guesstimate where we're going to get our most adjustment. Now you see how that ring is butted right up against the ocular bell now. Now that means that that's as far forward as the scope can slide until you run into your bell. So this ring ultimately would do best to go right here, because that's as far forward as it can go before it hits the turret housing. So we look on here and we see it's going to go in this slot right here, the slot right behind our screw. We're going to set our scope down. We'll set this ring in there. And again, tighten it up, push forward while you snug that down. Now we're just going to set our scope back in here again and check. Now if you notice here at the front of the scope, we've got a little issue. When the scope's back, the bell hits the front of our base. Now that's one of the problems you run into with these extended bases. Now you've got two solutions on that. When you go to set your eye relief, which we'll do here in a second, if you keep running into this and you can't get the scope far enough back because your eye relief, you can either go with taller rings, which I don't really like because that messes up your cheek weld back here. You have to have a higher comb to compensate for it. Or you can just simply trim a little bit of that base off, smooth it down with some sandpaper, and then hit it with some Aluma Black or some paint or anything else to cover up the bare aluminum. I know some of you guys are going to cringe on that, but it's the proper way to fit the base instead of just jacking the rings up a little bit more. We're just going to sit it forward, just forward enough so that we don't have any interference with the edge of the base. Give it a little space for recoil. Nothing should really flex on this rifle under recoil. The 308's a rather mild load. It's not going to cause the scope to flex like in all the videos you've seen of the 50 calibers firing. Now one of the main reasons we wanted to do this video with our TPS rings here is TPS rings mount a little bit differently than most of the scope rings that we use. TPS rings are designed so that you actually tighten them down on one side and it leaves you a gap on the other side for adjusting the scope. Then when you finally tighten down the other side, it locks the scope in. Now to know which side you want to tighten down and which side you don't want to tighten down, if you look on the rings here, they put index marks. You've got a dot on each side, but on the index side you've got a dot with a line coming out of it. On the cap, on the corresponding side, you've got a dot with a line coming out of it. Now the lines are going to fit together. So when we put these rings together, that's the side that's going to go together, that's the side that's going to get tightened down first. When we do that, it's going to leave a gap on the other side. Now, it's not anywhere near that big a gap. When you tighten them down, it's just a barely discernible gap, but it's there, and it allows you to rotate the scope. It allows you to rotate the scope without really torquing anything down. Snug those back on here, pushing forward. Set our scope back in. Now once you set the scope in, what I like to do is take the rings. You'll set your first cap on. Again, the TPS rings, we made sure the index marks are lined up. Thread your first set of screws in. On the TPS rings, we're going to thread them in just one side, just the left side for these rings. And we're not even going to tighten them down, we're not even going to snug them up. We're just going to close them down until we remove the gap on that side. And we're going to do the same thing with this other one, making sure our index lines line up. Set the ring cap on. And just hand tighten these. Now, we're going to check our eye relief through the scope. Make sure it's lined up here. It's good to go. I like to check my eye relief in several different positions, because generally when you're on the rifle prone, your head is going to be further forward than if you're on the rifle behind a bench or if you're on the rifle offhand. So check the eye relief in several different positions. Now, this is the time when you take your rifle out and you make sure that the reticle is plumb, that it's straight, it's not canted at all. Now, because of the limitations of our studio here, we're not going to take it out and line it up, but there are two different ways to do this. When I'm working on scopes indoors on the bench, what I generally do is I just eyeball it. I'll get behind the rifle, I'll make sure that the reticle looks plumb to the recoil pad on the stock, line it up with the two screw holes on the back of the stock, line it up through an imaginary line on the back of the bolt handle. And basically, if you have the crosshair lined up directly through an imaginary line on the back of the bolt handle and through the mounting screw on the tang, then you know that the reticle is plumb to the bore of the rifle. That's about as good as it gets. Now, some guys that aren't real comfortable with lining it up with their eyeballs, they like to use bubble levels and all that. Another simple, easy way that you can go about doing it is to get your rifle out, sandbag it in, place a bubble level across the Picatinny rail. Set your scope in, and downrange, take you a target, and you either run a plumb line, or you can take a carpenter's level and draw a line down a target that's perfectly vertical. Set your rifle in the sandbags, make sure that it is perfectly level. Set your scope in the caps, rotate it until the vertical crosshair lines up with the line that you've drawn on the target. Then tighten everything down and you're relatively certain that it's going to be plumb. I like my eyeball method just because it's a whole lot quicker. It's proven accurate over time and it works for me. If it doesn't work for you, then try one of the other methods. They make a whole bunch of different gadgets out there. If you have a scope that's flat on the bottom, you can use the feeler gauge method, where you insert feeler gauges underneath the scope to line up with the turret housing. That will not work on the Bushnell 10X that we have here because it has a round bottom. You can put feeler gauges underneath here and you can have it up to 15 or 20 degrees off of level, and the feeler gauge method just won't work on it. Now, once you've got your scope level and tightened down here, you're going to come back and you're just going to hand tighten your screws into the other side. Now, whenever you're tightening screws, especially steel screws, into aluminum rings, what I like to do is begin by turning them backwards, and you'll feel the screw moving slowly and smoothly, and then you should feel and hear a click when the threads engage. Just there, you heard a click and it dropped down just a little bit. Now that gives us the green light to turn it the other direction, and the threads will engage, and we can just smoothly and evenly tighten it down. That keeps us from cross threading. Every now and again with steel screws and aluminum threads, you'll get a burr in here or there, and that burr will cause the threads to cross, and once you've cross threaded a screw hole in an aluminum ring, you've buggered it up pretty good. Your only solution is pretty much going to be to drill it out and put in helicoil or some other kind of steel threaded insert to keep it good to go. You can of course always drill it oversized and then thread it and run an oversized screw, but then you've got one oversized screw in your rings. I don't think that's a really good solution. I think I would probably just trash the ring instead and buy a new ring. Okay, now we've gone out, we've made sure that our scope is set to the proper eye relief and that we've got our reticle level, and we're good to go. On this scope, for me, I would really like to have it moved just a little bit further to the rear. At some point later on, I think we are going to trim a little bit of the front of this base just to give us a little bit more leeway to the rear. We'll have to see how that goes when we replace the stock. If we replace the stock on this, the comb may be a little bit higher and prevent us from having to do that. We may need to go a little bit taller rings, but we'll have to see what that holds for us in the future. Now we've got everything mocked up to where we want it. We're ready to go ahead and tighten our rings down. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to tighten these scope rings to the base. As before, when we put them on here hand tight, we made sure that they were pushed all the way forward. If you ever have to remove the scope for whatever reason, when you reinstall the scope, before you tighten the rings down, make sure that the scope is pushed forward. Always remember, push the scope forward. To tighten these rings down, we're going to use our Borka driver here. You've seen this when we install our base. It's a very simple torque tool, very easy to carry in your pack. Some guys have even said they carry these in the stock pack on the side of the rifle. I don't know if I go that far, but it is extremely lightweight and it's a very high quality tool. What we're going to do is we're going to find our torque reading on the side here. For the large 7/16 inch nuts that are on the side of the rings, we're going to go with 65 inch-pounds. That's what the manufacturer recommends. So we're going to put our bit holder through the hole marked 65. We're going to put our handle back on, squeeze it down, and then we're going to take our adapter with our 7/16 inch socket on, put it on there, slide it on, and just simply snug it down. Snug the front one down a little bit, snug the back one down a little bit, and I always like to alternate. Anytime I'm doing this kind of stuff, I always like to alternate which rings I'm tightening down. It just seems to give me more even results. Got that tightened down. And there we go. Those are 65 inch-pounds on each one. Now, TPS recommends in their instructions that you only tighten the rings down as tight as you can comfortably get them by hand using the little Torx wrench that they provided. They are the manufacturer. If you don't know what you're doing, it's always best to do what the manufacturer is telling you to do. However, I like to have a number. If I ever have to remove the rings from the scope, When I put it back together, I want to know that it's as close to the original setup as it originally was. I don't like to do just hand tight, because if I don't eat my Wheaties on one day, I may not be able to get them as tight as if I eat my Wheaties on the next day. So we're going to go ahead, and the screws that are on these rings are T15 Torx, and we've had good luck in the past with 15-inch pounds on cap screws. So we're going to go ahead and tighten these to 15-inch pounds. And per TPS, we're going to go on the side with no gap first. That was the side that our index mark was on. We're going to go ahead and tighten that down first. If I can get this to drop into the screw hole here. That's 15. You saw it wasn't a whole lot more than me using the small end of that wrench. Not a whole lot more force involved, so we're not worried about some massive amount of gorilla force to tighten these down. And there we go. One thing left to do is to take it out to the range and zero it. We will do that in a separate video. Hope you enjoyed this rather simple but detailed video on how to mount your scope. Couple of exceptions that we'll cover real quick. If you are using standard rings, not TPS rings, then what you want to do when you set the caps on here, after you get everything set up and you get your scope level, leave one cap alone, take the other cap, and you're just going to put your screws in, and you're going to eyeball the gap on both sides. You want to make sure you have even gap on both sides of the ring. And you're going to tighten them in a crisscross fashion, retaining that even gap. Just keep going around crisscross back and forth until you get them snug down hand tight. Once you get the one ring snug down hand tight, I recommend that you go ahead and torque that ring to specifications, either what the manufacturer specifies, or if you're T15 Torx, you can do it to 15-inch pounds. Then switch to the other ring and do the same thing with the other ring. This can help eliminate the scope twisting in the mounts as you go down and you set that in. You want even gap so that you don't have uneven pressure on one side of the scope or the other. I hope this helps eliminate some questions. This really isn't that difficult. If you follow this, you shouldn't have any problems with your scope slipping in the base, and we don't really worry about lapping because we bedded the base in. There shouldn't really be any misalignment of the rings. When we pull this scope out of this base, or out of these rings, in about 1,500 to 2,000 rounds, I will almost bet that you won't see any ring marks on the tube at all. Bedding the base seems to help eliminate any ring marks on the tube at all. I hope you found this useful. Looking forward to talking to you again.